All right, Parsha 101, Parshas Terumah. This week's Torah portion is mainly all about the construction of the Mishkan, the Tabernacle in the desert. And there's a lot of description about the different parts, most of the vessels that were going to be part of it, the walls, what it was made out of, etc. And the name Terumah actually comes from the second verse of the Torah portion, which is Daber b'nei Yisrael v'yikchu li Terumah me'ez kol ish. Speak to the children of Israel and take from them Terumah from each man. Terumah means like a donation, a contribution, because while there was a certain half shekel that every man had to give, and then this was actually going to go into the basis, which put that aside for a moment, and then there were also, it was an annual half shekel that was given for communal offerings that kind of had to be given every year. Every other aspect of what had to be donated was all according to each person, according to what they could give, according to what their feeling was to give, etc. There was no a specific amount. It was each according to what they wanted to give. Now, it actually specifies the men here because there's different parts of the building of the tabernacle and building the Mishkan in the desert. But part of the specification for the men is because this was going to rectify the sin of the golden calf. It was going to happen anyways, because this was going to be a permanent dwelling where godliness would always be manifest in the world, right? God is everywhere in the world, but in the Mishkan was a place where God would always be manifest. So sort of what was first felt at Sinai, at the giving of the Torah, how are we going to ever revisit that feeling? By going to in the Mishkan, we'd feel godliness there. And then later in the Beis HaMikdash, the Holy Temple in Jerusalem. So that's what the Mishkan that we talk about, it's a home for God here in this world. It means this is where godliness would be manifest. So this follows, even though the Torah portion comes now, right after we spoke about the giving of the Torah, we spoke about a lot of the laws, and now this Torah portion comes here now. The building of it didn't actually occur until after the sin of the golden calf, right? Because first Moshe has to go up on the mountain, get the Torah, comes down, the miscalculated, etc., etc. We're going to get to all those stories. And so that's where it would come in actuality. But here is where it's being spoken about. Here's where it's being commanded. So the sin of the golden calf was specifically something that the men and not the women participated in. So that's why the women were not necessarily mandated in the same way, because they did not participate in the sin of the golden calf. Now, what's kind of stuff, what are we looking at? What was donated? So you're talking about gold and silver and copper and goat hair, I guess, and wool that's dyed turquoise colors and purple and scarlet. Those are actually three main colors that were there, and red dye ram skin and the skin of this animal called a tachash, which was considered like this multi-hued special kind of animal that they found in the desert for the purpose of the Mishkan. It would be acacia wood. If you remember, we spoke about how when Yaakov went down to Mitzrayim, he brought with him acacia trees. And so part of that was, he said, because you're going to have a Mishkan, they're going to have it for. And also, but then again, why did you have to bring with it? Because then you plant this grove of these acacia trees, right? And throughout the slavery and the exile, you point to them, you say, remember these, right? This is for when we're going to go free. This is for when we're going to be building the Mishkan for God. They were also supposed to donate oil for illuminating, like olive oil, spices for like the anointing oils and the incense. There were different kinds of stones. All this kind of stuff was supposed to be donated. And a lot of this came from the treasures they took out from Egypt. All this kind of stuff, however much you want to give, we just got to make piles and piles to give. Now also, there's the very famous phrase that God said, the verse that V'asuli mikdash v'shchanti b'silcham. You should make for your mikdash a sanctuary, and I'll dwell amongst them, right? So the question is, you should make a Mishkan that's a singular, v'shchanti b'silcham, I'm going to dwell among them. Why do we go plural? Because this is God saying that, as in wherever I will be allowed to dwell, there I will dwell. So if you make your own personal home, your own personal space, your own personal self, you make it holy, you make it a place for godliness to be, I will be there. So I will dwell in the heart, I will dwell within each and every one and each and every person who makes a home for me, wherever that home may be, not just in an actual Mishkan. Okay, so now we're going to go to the actual, pieces of the Mishkan that were built. The first thing that it tells us about is the Arm, the Holy Ark. Okay, and this was made, it was made is 2.5 cubits by 1.5 cubits. So it's 2.5 cubits long, 1.5 cubits wide, and 1.5 cubits high. And just to get a sense of what's a cubit? Cubit is about 48 centimeters, or like 1.57 feet. So you're talking about 2.5 cubits. You're looking at something that's a little bit over 3 or 4-ish feet or something. So someone else could do the math. A lot of math there. But anyways, that's the general size of it. And there's going to be 3 boxes. So you're going to have an outer gold box, and there's going to be a wood box made out of acacia, and then another gold box inside of it. So one inside of the other. And each one is going to be, like, one's 8 handbreadth, 9 handbreadth, 10 handbreadth tall. A handbreadth is about 8 centimeters. We're going to see these measurements a lot. The cubit, which is 1.57 feet, and the handbreadth, which is 8 centimeters. So just kind of file that away because these keep coming up, these measurements. Now, there's going to be a decorative golden rim on the outer chest, so the outer gold chest of the ark. So kind of like a square. But let's actually, there's a box. So this box had like a gold rim, decorative gold rim. And now inside the whole aron, so inside the inner box, the inner gold box, the luchos, the tablets went in there. Okay, now there were 4 gold rings that were made, one at each corner. And through those gold rings were 2 long rods of acacia wood that were overlaid with gold, were inserted into those. Right, so not just that way they were supposed to carry it because they had to carry it, right? And specifically for the aron versus other parts of the Mishkan that were built, these rods were never taken out. They were supposed to always be in there. Now you had a cover for the aron, right? It's not just 3 empty boxes sitting there. So you have the luchos inside, then you have the cover, which is about 2.5 cubits long, 1.5 cubits wide. It was made out of pure gold, and from that same piece of gold, they were supposed to craft these 2 kruvim, the cherubim. Right, so not separate pieces of gold, but from the same piece of gold, you craft these 2 kruvim, and these looked like sort of like angelic creatures with infant faces, with children's faces. They had these big long wings. They were supposed to kind of face downward and in toward the cover, and their 2 wings like held aloft, facing toward each other. And it was 10 handbreadths high, so it's about 80 centimeters tall. And Hashem says, my voice will come out from between the 2 kruvim, that's where my voice will come out. That Moshe he wouldn't be standing in, because that was in the Holy of Holies. Moshe would be standing outside of it, but that is through where my voice will come through. Okay, so that's the aron, that's the ark. Next we have the table, the shulchan. Okay, so we call it a table, but it was kind of like it was showcase that it's made out of acacia wood. It's about 2 cubits long. So you're talking about a little bit over 3 feet long, 1 cubit wide, 1.5 cubits high. This was just the base, actually, of the table. And this was a gold overlay of the acacia wood. So you have the acacia wood, your overlay with gold. And there was a rim that was attached to a frame. And then there's also four gold rings placed at each of the 4 corners. 4 legs for the table. And then there were rods of acacia overlay with gold that were put in through the rings, right? Because again, all these pieces had to be carried. When they moved from place to place in the desert, they had to carry them somehow. So you had these rods that went into these rings, and they would be able to lift up these pieces. Because you're not going to disassemble the pieces, disassemble them each time. The pieces that were made, and then you have to be able to carry them, lift and carry. So that's how they would carry them. Now, on this is the base of the table. On that, we're now going to be the showbreads, what's called the lachem hapanim. We're going to be on them. So it's 12, we're going to call them loaves, but they weren't really loaves of bread because the way they were shaped, it was a flat piece that was made 5 by 10 handbreadths. Okay, so remember that's 8 centimeters is a handbreadth. And then you would put 4 cubes of dough at the corner. So imagine you have a flat piece of dough, kind of like a rectangle. Then you have 4 square pieces at each corner, and then you got to kind of take it from the bottom and you fold it up and inward. So it had this like really kind of interesting shape, the way it bent inward. And these were unleavened bread. There was a miracle that they would stay fresh from one week to the next. So they were made on Fridays. Shabbos they were switched out, and then the Kohanim, the priests, would eat them, and they'd be fresh as if they just came out of the oven. Now, these were made in these iron kind of forms, kind of like, imagine just like a flat sheet with 2 sides, right? Because that helps shape it. And then after that, they were placed on these gold-like forms kind of things, and those rested on this kind of like half-tube shelvings. So sort of like, if you have these rolling trays that you can like put, that's on wheels, and you can kind of slide trays into it. So it was sort of looked like that, except what it rested on was kind of these half tubes trays. If any of this makes sense. And they'd slide these gold trays into them that had the bread on it. So you could stack 6 and 6, because 12 altogether, so 2 rows kind of 2 columns of 6. All this stuff, highly recommend. This has all been recreated by scholars and rabbis, and definitely should look all this up to see for yourself kind of what all these look like, because the details are very intricate, and these are, very unique pieces that were created specifically for the Mishkan. Anyways, in between these 2 stacks, there were 2 spoons of frankincense. Okay, and all the pieces, everything's made out of gold. The spoons that they were on is made out of gold. Everything's gold. Oh, and also these tubing trays were on these supporting frames. So you had a table, you had 2 big supporting frames that these breads could then be slid into the tubings. The kind of the shelvings of them. Okay, so that's the shulchan, that's the table. Next we have the menorah. Now the menorah is supposed to be made of 1 piece of solid gold. And just to kind of skip to the end a little bit, after Hashem explained, okay, this is what the menorah is supposed to look like, Moshe's like, I don't get it. I don't really understand what's going on here. And so Hashem's like, okay, don't worry, I got you. And he shows him a big fiery form what the menorah is supposed to look like. And Moshe's like, I still don't get it. And Hashem's like, just throw the big piece of gold into the fire and it will take on a form by itself. Because when you see what the menorah looked like, it's big, intricate piece, but then, again, it's all supposed to be made out of 1 single piece of gold. It's not supposed to be other piece of gold that you could take and attach it to it. So, that's where it gets a little tricky. Now, the entire menorah is about 18 handbreadths tall, so 18 times 8 centimeters. And then you've got, there were 3 stone steps that led up to it. Because when the high priest would go and light the menorah, they weren't supposed to lift their hand very high up, because they had the name of God was on their forehead, which we get to when we learn about the clothing. But so that way they had to, 3 steps would raise them up, so that way they could be able to light at a little more like arm, shoulder level. Now you had a 3-legged base at the bottom. The way the menorah in the Mishkan was 7 branches. One's the middle, right? You have the middle pole kind of, and then there were 6 branches moving diagonally away from center. And at each point, so this is at like the 9th, 11th, and 13th handbreadth, just to give all the information. So at each point where it branches away, you have a new set of branches branching away, there was like a sphere there that kind of marked where that point was. There were 3 types of decorations on the menorah. You had this kind of sphere, this like circular, because they're 3Ds. So it was like a sphere, then you had these flowers that were made, and then you had, they call it a goblet. So it's basically like if you take a wine glass and you'd cut off the top and then hang it upside down. And then there were the actual lamps. The lamps were actually made out of separate pieces of gold. But everything else was made out of 1 single piece of gold. Each branch had 3 goblets on it, and then a sphere and a flower, and then there was the lamp. So you have that 7 times, and again, you have the spheres in the middle. That's where each of the branches move away from. A little bit lower down, you have like a sphere, a goblet, and a flower. And then all the way at the bottom, before the base, is another flower. Basically, there were 9 flowers, 11 spheres, and 22 goblets in total. And then it was a 3-legged base that the menorah was on. And all this 1 solid piece of gold. And then because we have 7 lights, you have 7, these are separate gold pieces of 7 lamps. And it was supposed to be constructed so that the flames of the menorah would all burn kind of inward, all towards center. Now, there were also like other implements that were made to kind of, as part of the lighting of the menorah. So you have like these tongs, to fix the wicks, tongs, and these scoops. These are all made out of pure gold. The menorah itself, I think, it was made out of 1 talent of gold. So about 48 kilograms or 106 pounds of gold. So it was a big piece. Now, okay, so that's the menorah. Next, we have all the coverings. Okay, so the Mishkan, the Tabernacle, was this big, long, rectangular structure. Okay, and again, because it's something that they got to be able to move around with in the desert, you're not just going to build a bunch of stones and you can move them around. So they were all made out of these, the whole base was made out of planks of wood, and you had, the whole structure is planks of wood and tapestries, and very intricately done. So you have these coverings that would cover the roof and the external walls. It was kind of draped over the whole structure. So a massive, massive tent, but like a flat rectangle tent. So the first set, you have like these 10 tapestries that were made, and they were made out of this thread that was woven out of 24 strands. Okay, so there's like 6 linen twisted together, six strands of turquoise wool twisted together, 6 strands of scarlet wool twisted together, and 6 strands of purple wool twisted together. So you have 6, 6, 6, and 6 of all the different kind of threads, and all of those need to be twisted together in the 24 strand material that is what everything is going to be woven out of. So it's this, you can imagine the colors that were in this. And these coverings are made out of a woven design, and the design that would be woven into it was going to be this recurvim. It's kind of like the cherubim again, but these were going to have on one side, they were going to have like eagle shapes to them. On the other side, they were going to have lion shapes to them. And altogether, it's 28 cubits in length and 4 cubits wide. So remember, a cubit's about 1.57 feet. So very, very big, because what it has to be able to do is it has to drape over the roof and fall along the sides, fall along the walls of the Mishkan. So now you're making 10 tapestries. Okay, if you're still following, and you're sewing, you have to sew together 5 together. So you have a set of 5, a set of 5. And then there were holes made of turquoise wool all along each, the 2 ends of each of the 5 sets. And they were held together by golden clasps. So you can actually go and just like cinch them together all the way down the middle. And then they would drape that over the structure of the Mishkan. Then on top of that, you had a second covering that was made out of 11 sheets of goat hair. And it was 30 cubits in length and 4 cubits wide. So this one was a panel of 5 and 6 because there was supposed to be extra draping over the front, right? And what combined these 2 panels with these 50 loops of goat hair and 50 copper clasps. So first you've got the intricate, colorful tapestry goes first. Then you have the goat hair tapestry goes on top of it. And then there was another tapestry that went on top of that was made out of red dyed ram skins. That's 30 by 10 cubits. So 30 cubits long and 10 cubits wide. And then there was another covering of tachash skins. This tachash animal again was this multicolored, multi-hued skin tone. So some commentaries say that it was actually part of the red ram skin, and some say it's another covering. So it's another covering on top of everything. But this is what's draping the tabernacle. Okay, so this is what the Mishkan is draped with. Now we have to make the walls of the Mishkan. Okay, so the walls of the Mishkan were made out of planks of acacia wood. Back to the acacia wood, right? So they were 10 cubits in length. They were 10 cubits tall. So 10 cubits tall. Yeah, so in length, 1.5 cubits wide, and 1 handbreadth. 1 breadth of 1 cubit. The thickness of it. Now, the bottom cubit, so bottom 1.57 feet, was kind of, they kind of had to like whittle it, they kind of had to carve it to look like 2 sort of like inserts, kind of like a plug actually, like an electric outlet, so like two kind of pieces of like inserts, because those were going to be inserted into the bases that they stood upon. Is this kind of like the first Lego ever created? That's kind of what these are. So now you have a south wall and the north wall. These, because it's a rectangle, these are going to be longer walls. So these each have 20 planks of wood. So they weren't going to be like 30 cubits, and all these planks of wood had to stand flush against each other. But now how do you make sure that they stand up? Okay, so they constructed these 40 silver bases. They were kind of like sockets. That's basically what it was. So that way the walls would plug into these sockets. So you have these acacia wood. They're actually overlaid in gold, and then you plug them into silver bases, the silver sockets. And you line them all up next to each other. The sockets themselves are about 1 cubit tall, right? Because they've got to fit the entire bottom cubit in. Now, so that's the north wall and the south wall. The west wall, which was 6 planks, and then you had another 2 for the corners, which we'll get to in a second. And then the east doesn't have any planks because that's the entrance. They would enter from the east, and then you have the Mishkan lays out from there. Now, also to get everything to stand up, right, and have everything standing flush, they had these poles. Each one got about 5. There were 5 sets of poles for each one because they were inserted in 3 different points. So there was one long one that was the length of the wall, and that they drilled a hole in the middle of the plank, so at the 5 cubit mark, and this pole went all the way through the middle. So that they inserted all the way through. You couldn't see this pole, just an acacia rod that went all the way through. Then you had 2 more that were half the size of the wall. So for example, when we have the one, well, it's not half the size. So we have, we had 2, there were 2 more ones that went in at the 7.5 mark and at the 2.5 mark. And these were long, they were also acacia poles, and they were overlaid with gold. these were not drilled into, these were hooked into the outside. There were these gold rings that were put onto the outside of each of these planks of wood, kind of these beams. The beams is a better word. There were beams of wood, and there were gold rings on the outside of it, and they were covered over entirely. So that way, when you slotted the poles in, it looked like they were totally overlaid with gold also, because they were inserted all the way through in this just like gold kind of tube ring. They went all the way through. So you have one rod going through the middle, the actual middle of the beams, and then you had two more sets of rods that went at the top, with the middle of the top half of the beam and the middle of the lower half of the beam. These are on the external part of the beam that they slotted all the way through. So that's how the wall set up. That's what that was made of. So now we got the coverings, we got the walls, we got the urn, we got the shulchan, we got the menorah. Now we have the parochas. That's the partition, kind of the curtain that went sectioned off the inside, because where the urn was, that would be the Holy of Holies, the Kodesh HaKodashim, the ark was. Nobody's allowed to enter there. Only the high priest went in there on Yom Kippur. That was a totally partitioned off section, and it was sectioned off by this curtain, this parochas that was created. The rest of it, what was on the other side of it, is where you have the shulchan, the menorah. There's going to be a mizbeach and a choshet, the copper mizbeach, where they offered incense. It's actually not described in this parsha. Anyway, so this parochas was made out of the same 24-strand kind of material, and it was 10 cubits tall, 10 cubits wide, and 1 handbreadth thick, because it also had to go, from length to length, from up to down, and from side to side. It had to go, and it was hung on these beams of 4 acacia wood. These 4 acacia wood pillars. They were in gold, and they had 4 gold hooks in them. So it was hung horizontally across this parochas, and these were inserted into silver bases. So you click them into these silver bases, and that's what divides it. So the Kodesh HaKodashim, the Holy of Holies, with 10 cubits, so 1.57 feet times 10, and then the rest of it, the Kodesh, was 20 cubits, so 1.57 feet times 20. And the Aron, with the poles in it, actually went from one wall to the other wall. It kind of like jutted into the parochas a little bit. So it was lengthwise the exact size of the Kodesh HaKodashim. There was a whole miracle that happened with it, that it, even though it was there, it didn't really take up space, but it was present. And that's just this, because of the high spiritual dimension of it. It was of this world and also not of this world at the same time. It was a very holy situation. So now in the Kodesh, in the Kodesh itself, you have the shulchan, right where the showbreads are. That was on the north side. That was closer to the north wall. And then you had the menorah stood by the south wall. It was 2.5 cubits away from the wall. Okay, so almost done. Now we have what's called the masach, the screen that was by the entrance of the Mishkan. This was made out of the 24 thread thing again, but this was embroidered with eagles and lions on both sides. It was 10 cubits tall, 10 cubits wide, and it was hung on 4 acacia pillars. So this was you have the entire Mishkan was constructed, and then there was the entrance was marked by this screen. And it was also hung horizontally on a pole with hooks, and everything is gold, except the bases of this one were copper, not silver. Copper bases. Okay, then we got 2 more things, and this parsha is done. Now we move to the outside. This is the Mishkan, the Tabernacle itself. Now we're moving into the courtyard of the Tabernacle, which was in a big, massive space. And what's in the courtyard is you have the mizbeach is there, where the animal sacrifices were offered that was outside of the actual structure, right? And that's part of the wider compound, I guess you could say, but this is not part in the actual structure of it. So this mizbeach, 10 cubits tall, there are 2 parts to it. First you have the piece. This was made out of acacia wood, and it was a box. It was a hollow box that was made, because when they traveled, it was hollow, and then when they would set up camp, they would fill the inside with earth. They would fill it with dirt to hold it down. So it was 10 cubits tall, 5 cubits long, 5 cubits wide, and there were kind of these protrusions at each corner on the top. And then you had there was a limited space there for the Kohanim to kind of walk around on top, because they would go to the top of the Beth. That's where they would offer the sacrifices. In the center of it, this kind of 1 square cubit area is where there would be the wood pile where they would offer the sacrifices. This whole Mizbeach had a copper overlay, not a gold one. Everything inside the Mishkan was gold overlay. Everything outside of it, most of the stuff that was outside of it, all the outside stuff has copper, not gold. Now, there's an interesting thing. This Mizbeach is where the animals were sacrificed. And the three main animal sacrifices is an ox, a sheep, and a goat, right? And kind of what the sacrifice of the animal, what it represented is we call it it's the slaughtering of the animal, but it's kind of the renouncing of the animal self. So these three animals represent three types of animal selves. You have an ox, which is considered like a confrontational animal, the one that's always like, fighting against what it's got to do. Then you have a sheep, which is like a conformist kind of animal, right? It goes along to get along. So it doesn't necessarily stand up for what it's got to stand up for. And then you have the goat, which is considered a stubborn animal. It's like set in its ways and it's not going to change. So whichever one of these either are closer to the kind of quote unquote animal within us, or whichever one of these represents sort of the sin that the person is now bringing the sacrifice for, they're kind of like, look, I'm renouncing this animal part of me. I'm renouncing the stubbornness or the conformity, that didn't let me stand up, or the confrontational part of me that reacted, that bucked against what I was supposed to do. So just interesting on that. Now, there was also copper instruments that went with this mizbeach. So there was like a pot, and a scoop, and a basin, and a fork, and a fire pan. All these things for like cleaning out the ashes, turning over the meat, all that kind of stuff. You need utensils for all these sort of things. Now, at the midpoint of this mizbeach, so you're talking about this big square structure. At the midpoint of it, there was like a copper kind of like grating sort of network, that grate thing, and that was specifically at the 6th cubit mark. So it went from the 5th to the 6th cubit. Well, from the 6th cubit down to the 5th cubit, to the top of the 5th cubit, and that marked the midpoint. And that was important to know because it had something to do with the sacrifices and the blood and this, that, whatever. And then there were 4 copper rings that were placed on each corner, because also you could have the rods of acacia, this time overlaid with copper, that would be inserted there for when they had for transportation. There was also a decorative border by the 7th cubit. Now, if you remember going back to 2 parshas ago, Yisro, it ended off talking about how to get up to this mizbeach, there shouldn't be steps, there should be a ramp. Remember? So there was a big ramp that on its flat on the bottom, like we just measured from the bottom, not going upward, was about 30 cubits long on the south side. So that's a really long, it's a massive ramp leading up to the mizbeach. Now, just to wrap up the Parsha, it describes the Chatzar, which is the courtyard of the Mishkan. So you have the Mishkan proper, and it was surrounded by a massive kind of wall structure, and that would be the entire compound, kind of. So the south and the north wall were about 100 cubits long and 5 feet tall. What they were surrounded by was these like crocheted kind of like hangings of twisted linen. And they were hung across 20 pillars with copper bases. So remember, it's not gold anymore, it's not copper. So you're talking about these pillars were set up at 5 cubits apart, because it's 20 of them for 100 cubits. And then there was these hooks. It was this like whole thing with this like a hook on the pillar. Then there was this box. There was like a block that hung on the hook, and then they would somehow like rope the netting onto this block, and like that's how it hung. And these pillars were, the sides of them were copper, but they had silver tops. There were also these silver bands that kind of wrapped around, like a decorative thing, like a silver band that wrapped around them. And so that's the north and the south wall, and the west wall would be 50 cubits. And it would have 10 bases then. With 10 pillars with its bases. The east side actually there were 2 sets of, it was 15, because you're talking about 50 cubits. So you'd have 15 cubits of the hanging, and those were on 3 pillars. Then there was another screen made in the middle 20 cubits. And then you had another 15 cubits after that with the hangings again. And that middle screen, which hung over 4 pillars, that was made out of a different material. That was not the hangings. That was a different, that was one of the screens again. And anyway, so the Mishkan itself was in the western half of the enclosure. So that means, even though you have, the Mishkan itself was about like 30 cubits or something, 30 cubits by 10 cubits. So that doesn't fit into the 100 by 100 cubit. That doesn't fit into 100 by 50 cubits, right? So the western part of the structure is where the Mishkan was, and then you have the Mizbeach, and you have this like 50 by 50 cubit section, big 50 by 50 cubit opening there. And then it just rounds off to say that all the implements for building and dismantling the Mishkan were made out of copper. And that actually rounds off Parshas Terumah.